times where, that task is non-negotiable, both in the commercial world because, a client has set a deadline, or in the military world because, we've got to take that hill.
Yeah.
And that's when it pays dividends to have invested in the other two. So you can start to sweat the people.
Yeah.
You can start to put pressure on the team in order to achieve that task. But you can't do that all the time. You can't be at 100% all the time.
I know, 100%. I'd want to be careful I didn't come across as sort of transactional, but effectively every time you make a down payment on an individual's needs or an investment in the team's capability, then that is potentially a withdrawal that you can make when you need to get when the task is non-negotiable.
Hello and welcome to Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant. For those of you who are new to the podcast, we compare and contrast the business and the military environments when it comes to things like teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, organisations, culture, decision-making and strategy. This is the second in our series of interviews with Lt Col Joe Brown from the Royal Logistics Corps. If you happen to listen to last week's episode, you will know that Joe is an army officer who has recently finished his command of a regiment within the Royal Logistics Corps, but prior to that, specialised in counter improvised explosive devices. And last week we talked at length about the nuances of small team command, especially in high-risk environments, and that led on to a discussion about coaching and mentoring, and I said at the time that we would explore that in a future podcast. Well, now here we are. No, welcome back, Joe.
Oh, thanks for having me, Gareth.
Last week, we talked about your career and we used that as sort of the vehicle for exploring some of these topics, and it was a really interesting discussion. There was something you talked about towards the end where we were moving on to the idea of how you bring on and develop subordinates within your team, within your organisation. And we talked a little bit about the junior officers and junior officers being mentored, if you like, by their sergeants, by their senior NCOs, and the fact that we could probably get away with not having those platoon commanders, those troop commanders, and the sergeants would be able to get on with the job themselves. But the real value was that it gave them the leadership and command experience to be better leaders and managers later in their careers when they come back to do things like company and squadron command. They get to make their mistakes early, they get to develop. And you were talking about how you were working, I don't know whether this was subunit command or regimental command, but how you were working with your organisation and developing people. And you said a phrase, which I wrote down at the time, it's the decent thing to do. And that struck me because I think we all know that. It is, of course, as anybody who's in a position of authority that has responsibility over people within their organisation, I think we all know it's the decent thing to do is to help them, bring them along, develop them. But just because it's the decent thing to do doesn't mean it's the thing that is done. And I was reflecting on this after the conversation, and I was thinking about, certainly from my experience in the military, about the amount of time people spend developing their subordinates outside of what is expected in terms of career courses and the sort of specific career management, but the just general mentoring and development. And I saw some really, really good examples of it, but I saw lots of opportunities that were missed because it isn't part of the everyday job. And I think although it's the decent thing to do, it's a decent thing to do often on top of what you're expected to do, and therefore doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I mean, I can accept that for some that might view it like that. I mean, when we were talking before, we also talked about doing the basics on operations to keep people alive.
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes it's stuff that's unseen. The stuff happens in the middle of the night at the unloading bay that you make sure that the soldier has got a torch, pointing down onto the weapon to make sure that there's no round in the chamber once they've unloaded, and that means they're not going to have a negligent discharge and it's safer. I suppose that, outside of that little bubble, that little moment between the probably relatively junior leader and the person who's junior to them. That's effectively a private moment between those two people. And outside that bubble, nobody knows that that's going to happen. But the good leaders do it. They do it right when no one's looking, and that makes that little action safer. And I think that that's what good leaders do with regards to mentoring. So as a CO, I could look down to my OCs, had 4 task squadrons and a light aid detachment from the REME that maintain our equipment. So 5 squadron OCs. Well, I don't know what's happening in their SHQ, in their own headquarters every day, and I don't need to know. But what I like to think was that they would take that time to mentor that troop commander or that senior NCO to say, listen, how you just did that, we could have done that better. Or how did you think that went? And then have a conversation that isn't either coaching or mentoring. And I think too much time spent on dividing up the difference between the two things. They're about making individuals better, and that aggregates together to make teams better, which aggregates together to make organization better. So the additional effort that you want to hope people are putting into bringing on those, that usually that coaching and mentoring goes down the way, but not always. It can be reversed. But that activity, no one knows no one could see it happening. You could get away with not doing it. I agree, not enough of it happens, but actually we've got to find a way of putting a value on it, because the value of not teaching your juniors to be better in the future is that your future organization fails. Yeah, especially in a bottom-up organization.
Yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit on that, in that I agree there is lots of activity that happens outside of the oversight of the command. So that's about making sure people are doing the right things. And of course, part of that is teaching them the right things so that they learn how to do the job. But that's subtly different from developing people to step up to the next job. Hopefully, there are instances of not only the sergeant being there to check, the chambers of the weapon, but the sergeant taking a lance corporal along to say, you're about to go on a junior command course and promote. You do this. You check your section.
Yes, I agree that there is a difference between coaching and mentoring people in order that they can do their job effectively, and then finding that space to either step aside or back, or however you see it, to give that opportunity to that more junior person to step up and experience the greater responsibility that they hopefully aspire to have, and that the organization needs them to be able to have. Another guy I worked with previously, he sort of said to me, you've got to allow the second 11 to have a go sometimes. And I do think that in organizations, we tend to put our best people on our most challenging tasks. And that can sometimes mean that those people who aren't deemed to be our best people, and it's massively subjective, I think, especially in the military where we're not making money, that the people who are not necessarily seen as our best might become despondent because they don't get those opportunities. So there's something about generating that behavior within your immediate team, and then hoping it percolates out into your organization to say, hey, listen, if this thing doesn't go perfectly well, that's totally fine, but that leader now has had that opportunity and they are going to learn from it. But it requires a mindset. It requires perhaps an articulation of risk. Sometimes you might say, I've got to do this thing, and I'm accepting no risk on this one.
I want my best people to do it. Yeah.
But then you might flip it around. So actually, we've got an opportunity for more risk to be taken here. So as long as things are safe, then let's experiment, whether that be in outputs or in terms of the inputs that we have. That might be a way that you can do that within your team, I think.
Yeah. So for that to happen, of course, if you're willing to not put your best team forward, as you say, the second 11 get a shot, and you're anticipating that the results might not be as good as they could be, you're going to take a bit of risk. Your boss, your superior, has to be willing to accept that and understand that as well, don't they? So how do you build that into the culture to make sure that your boss understands that your results aren't always as good as they could be because you're spending some of your capital on developing the team for the future?
Yeah, I suppose you can do it by way of a sort of pre-mortem with your boss. Hey, listen, I've got this event coming up. I'm intending to take some risk on it. So it's expectation management, if you like. Yeah. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to find an event or an opportunity for more junior people to step up, or perhaps not more junior, but not your A team, if you think it's going to be an event or a process that's going to draw the attention of your own boss, then you need to warn them off that you're using this as a developmental opportunity. I think it's courteous to make sure that they understand that actually this is an investment in the future growth of the organization, whether it be a business or a regiment or whatever. I've got a theory about what we ask of our leaders. I'll unpack it with you if you
Yeah, please do.
So when we talk about rhetoric in the UK, now in modern English, it tends to have an association with being about empty rhetoric.
Yeah.
But actually, rhetoric in the ancient Greek is the art of persuasion, and for me, that means leadership. And people used to pay the philosophers to be taught rhetoric, so they were effectively paying to be taught to be leaders. And Aristotle said that there's 3 pillars of rhetoric, and he talks about
ethos,
pathos, logos.
Yeah.
You haven't talked about this on the.
We haven't yet, no.
So for me, I was not a classical scholar, so I had to give some Google to this when I heard this term. But actually, having dug into it and to understand it, I actually think it's really pertinent for a military perspective, and I kind of think it's probably exportable to business. So the way I see it is, if we get our junior officers, and I said about really most junior officers are kind of having an apprenticeship. When you look at them as captains, and you say, well, actually, what we really need from our captains at regimental duty and on the staff is we need the logos, we need the logic. They need to know their stuff. Can this vehicle get from here to there on 1 tank of fuel, or do we need to stop and have a refuel? Is that going to have an impact on the route that we take, or the time it's going to take? So you've got to expect them to know their business, right?
Yeah.
And if they can't do that, then there's not many redeeming features if they don't know that, if they can't do the facts, the logos.
Yeah. And of course, there are lots of courses that junior officers go on to learn the attributes of their particular specialism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And they can be a very effective squadron level captain if they're just doing that.
Yeah.
But if we want to say to them, okay, that's great, but actually you aspire to be a major at some time, so therefore we're going to have to layer on top of that logos. And for me, the next thing's ethos. And ethos, that word's in more wide use in English now, but you think about it in terms of ethics, you think about it in terms of trust. And for me, what it meant as a commanding officer was, can I layer this major up with loads of work, fire and forget almost to them? You mission command, crack on. You need to know you're going to be able to trust them. And that comes back to, are they going to fess up to you when they can't deliver? Do you trust their good old fashioned values and standards? Are their attitudes and behaviors, completely, beyond reproach? Yeah. That's not to say that you'd expect shady behavior from a captain, but you might. there's an expectation of more proper behavior the more senior you are. So you layer on top of logos, and you might have someone who's perfectly logical and knows all the facts, but could be a bit of a rogue and a bit of a live wire. You always want to see those rough edges knocked off, and that contributes towards their ethos as they get up and some more senior. And then for me, the next step, and this is when, if I'm mentoring majors, I'm going to say, right, well, listen, you've got the logos, otherwise you wouldn't already be a major. It's clear that you know your business. It's clear that, for me, I feel like I can trust you. Or if I've had majors where I haven't really felt that I can trust them, or haven't felt that I can leave them with an intent and that they'll get what I mean and come back to me, then I've had to, use there's formal mechanisms of showing them how I want them to behave. But that next step is pathos, and pathos being the root of the words like empathy and sympathy. And so for more senior leaders, they're going to have to lead in such a way where they're not there on the ground at the point of the spear in the most dangerous bit, right? So that you'd expect a major to be leading their company, perhaps in close combat, they're going to be at the point of most danger. The CO, the lieutenant colonel, he might not be, because there's going to be many such points and he can't get around the battlefield. So therefore, for our more senior leaders, they're going to have to lead through pathos, so the empathy or sympathy. And basically, for me, what that means is being able to leave your intent on a group. It's like a personal brand or a vision statement or a North Star, whatever you want to call it. You call it any of those really. And then say, right, whilst you work in my gang, my organization, this is how I want us to behave. And this is why. And, you don't want to have leadership by slogan or like bumper sticker, but lots of army leaders will have kind of 3 A's or 3 R's, and robust, ready, and resilient, or whatever it is. Now they're kind of catchphrases that they hang their messages from, but they'll return to them, and they'll and repeat them. And actually, in my experience, even the most junior soldiers will remember what their leaders are, their 3 A's or 3 B's or whatever they are. There's that important message, because it's just 3 words that soldiers can kind of resonate with and say, oh, okay, I can't remember the rest of the stuff you wanted to do, but in the fog of war, or in the absence of direct direction in the here and now, I can remember that my leader wants that.
Yeah.
So I think there's something here about we've got to find a way of inculcating in our leaders as they become more senior or aspire to be more senior, moving them from logos through ethos and then into pathos.
I think that's really interesting. It resonates quite a lot with some of the things Chris and I have talked about in previous episodes. So we did one episode really early on about the definitions of missions, purpose, value, goals, all those kind of things. And of course, when you talk about ethos at that major level, that sort of middle management level, if you like, being about behaving to the right values and standards and inculcating that in their subordinates and their team, that strikes me as very much being aligned with the vision and the purpose of the organization. And then pathos is almost at that strategic level. And in another episode, we discussed and unpacked the term strategy, which is, of course, the art of the general. So it makes sense that you're at that more senior level and you're thinking about longer term perspectives, where you want to get to as an organization. And therefore, you're having to not only tell people what you want them to achieve now, but how that links to the goals that you stated. And you've got to tell that story. And I think I mentioned that to Chris, the idea that as a brigade commander or divisional commander, you have the immediate leadership challenge of your headquarters, the 100 or 200 people that are in and around where you work every day. But then you've got this much more ethereal leadership challenge of leading the division or the brigade or whatever it is, where you don't see them every day. They don't see you every day. And therefore you have to lead through the story that you tell. And I think this, certainly in the US military, we see it a lot more, but there are lots of examples of it across loads of nations. Commanders from history where they create a brand. And I know when I was operating in Kabul, I was working in a US chain of command, and people referred to the commanders by their nicknames or talked about them in terms of the characters that they have. And if you think about Montgomery famously wore 2 cap badges and always had a beret, whereas Patton always had a combat helmet. They were setting their brand. And I think that's part of that pathos, telling the story of who they are, what they represent, and how that links to what they're trying to achieve with an organization.
No, that resonates with me. I think my level of leadership so far is not is at the unit.
You haven't got a corn cob pipe just yet.
No. But I do think that having a personal brand and if in the example of Patton, actually because that helmet signifies a combat ethos, and therefore it helps him inculcate in his mind, in the minds of his soldiers, what he wants from them. We had a bit of a challenge when I was commanding officer of the logistic regiment, which is that just before I arrived, the unit had won the Army Cup for rugby, right? Rugby union. So big sport in the Army, hotly competed. My predecessor as commanding officer had played in the team, was an international rugby player himself. So as a schoolboy, so huge tradition of sporting excellence. It's really interesting that a lot of people, when I arrived, said, "Well, are you as keen on rugby as your predecessor was?" And I had to say to them, "Well, listen, I'm not anywhere as good as I hardly ever played, but I support sporting excellence." But actually, as a scratch behind the surface, actually, what I found was that some people who liked rugby thought this was a good thing that I would continue to support it. But some people actually felt that actually the rugby players were being privileged because they were away playing rugby, but they were Army champions and they'd not had to do some of the hard yards. They'd had to do less guard stints, or whatever. And other people had to backfill them. And there was, I wouldn't say simmering resentment, but there was a potential for it to become not the inclusive rallying achievement for the unit that perhaps people might think it would be. And I got to thinking about, what does it mean to a soldier who doesn't like rugby, who's got to do an extra guard shift because the guy who should be on guard is actually playing fly half on Wednesday in a semi-final of the Army Cup. What does that mean to that soldier? And actually, the point that I made to them is actually, it's kind of about brand, because before, it wasn't something I had to make up. It was very true that when I was working in Army headquarters, before I came to command the unit, when that regiment won the Army Cup, people said to me at my desk, why are you going to that regiment that's just won the Army Cup? It brought kudos to the unit. It brought kudos to the whole unit. And I said to the soldiers when I talked to them about this particular thing, which is that in my mind, it was about brand recognition. So people knew our regiment was the Army champions. And that meant that it was associated, the same as Coca-Cola sponsoring the World Cup. People associated that name with happiness. And that would play forward. And that brought us, it might be the difference between one soldier getting promoted and not getting promoted because the people will see that they're from that unit, and actually, they might not have played in the final themselves, but they've been part of that team effort. And so I think for me, there was something about pathos, which is if you can link the story to why somebody relatively junior has got to do something that they might not want to do, if anything you can do as a leader to help do that, then you're going to be more effective. And by extension, you've got to find ways of inculcating that in your junior leaders as they come through, that they need to know that they're going to have to do that in the future.
I have heard you talk about that theory before, but it's really interesting to explore it. And I think trying to think about the parallels between military command and commercial or business organizations is often quite difficult because we don't have the clear kind of organizational grouping, the rank on our chest and those sorts of things. But it's really useful, I think, to start to think about who's doing the logos, the operational delivery of task. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, that goes hand in hand with tactics, the delivery of capability. Who's doing the ethos? Who's trying to make sure that the application of that tactical activity, of that day-to-day operations, is in line with the values and the standards and the overall philosophy? And then who's setting the tone, who's setting that narrative? And of course, your command was mostly during the period of COVID.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
So firstly, how do you do pathos? How do you create a personal narrative when you can't get around and meet and glad hand, the men and women under your command? How do you ensure that your middle management, your squadron commanders, are managing that ethos, empowering the logos below that? And then going right back to the beginning of last week's podcast, when you talked about when you were doing EOD operations and you made everybody shave because you wanted the team to operate at the levels of the people that they were supporting.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that logos is happening down at those junior leadership levels when you're restricted by COVID? That must have been really challenging.
Yeah, I think I'll take the last one first. So about the logos, right? So I think the thing about with COVID was all of a sudden there was a load more logos that we had to apply, right? So there's all rules, the force, we called them the force health protection measures. And there were so many and they changed weekly and daily. So it was almost like a full-time job. And I had an absolutely superb quartermaster. He's like a senior, usually someone who joined the army as a soldier, gone all the way through the ranks and commissioned, and then they're usually, senior major. So been in the army 30 years. And he had an absolutely superb quartermaster who helped keep me legal in terms of making sure that we knew what policy needed to be implemented. But it came down to, soldiers washing their hands before they went into the cookhouse, and people wearing their masks when the mask mandate came in to help the hands face space, all of that. There was so many, what was in, what was out. It became very intricate. So there was a load more of that logos. And actually, I think there's probably two perspectives you can take on it. One, which was that because there were all of these rules, and actually soldiers, completely impossible to imagine that any walk of society would 100% go along with all the rules all the time, without any effort. This is just impossible. But soldiers became good at self-policing, and they knew what right was and they knew what wrong was. And that I actually think that it sort of bred more moral courage, because people started to realize that if they didn't do that thing, wash their hands before they went into the cookhouse, as an example, they would get called out on it. Yeah. And then perhaps it then made them more aware of doing the other basic things that we would want soldiers to do. So you asked me about sort of ethos, pathos, logos in the pandemic. I think first off, we had more logos to contend with during the pandemic.
And you said that makes people think about the other aspects of the things that they have to do day to day. Mm-hmm. Do you think that was because the impact of not doing it was more visceral. Yeah, if you don't wash your hands, you might spread that disease to your loved ones, or you might get ill. Or rather than a lot of what we do in the military is based around this idea of if and when we're on operations, if you're not doing these things now, you're not going to be doing it then.
Well, it was, I mean, yeah, there was that. Actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking, look, I remember saying at the time of the pandemic, we're used to getting trained up to go and do something dangerous away from home.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, we just started doing something dangerous, which was just doing our job. But we weren't away from home. We were with our families. Yeah. And there was no run up. It was, now we're doing it like this. And our families are in danger. So, when we're in Afghanistan, you go to the cookhouse in Afghanistan, there's somebody there saying, wash your hands before you go into the cookhouse. That was because of traditional diarrhea and vomiting, infection control that's any soldier's been on operations would understand. Yeah. They're not used to washing their hands before they go in the cookhouse in their barracks. Yeah. But now all of a sudden there was a reason to do it. So you had a soldier, at the start you had a junior NCO there telling people to do it, but then people started to do that and that just became normalized. So yeah, I think there was something about the imperative to apply these rules to keep ourselves safe and our wives and children, our brothers, mothers, our friends. It became a thing. So I think so. I think you asked about. I'd go to Paphos next. The first one you mentioned about you sort of said, how did I do that? Sure. Yeah, couldn't get around a glad hand. Yeah, it's really tricky. So we tried the Teams call, if you like. I tried to do before the pandemic kicked in. And my predecessors had instigated. They used to have like fireside chats, and they did by rank groups of private soldiers, junior NCOs, senior NCOs, and then do it with the warrant officers and the officers. And he and the RSM, and then when I came in, I carried it on. Me and the RSM would have a discussion. What is annoying you about this unit? What can we do better? What are you concerned about? What do you know about in the army that or not know about that you want to know about? What can I do to help you out? And then we'd start with the juniors. We'd go to the seniors. We'd do it over about a week. We'd then war game the things that came up, and then we'd have a sort of you said we'll do type session. Well, we just tried to do that on, well, it wasn't on a Teams call actually, because not everybody had a MOD laptop. So actually we did it via Slido to get the questions. And then I did it on a live stream on Instagram or something. We set up a Facebook group so that we could we didn't want any old person dialing in. We wanted it just to be our soldiers. And I think my sense was that soldiers reacted quite well to the fact that it probably felt a bit scrappy. Yeah. It's different being in a room full of soldiers and being asked questions, what about this, and then you can say what it is. But when it's coming over the internet and you're responding real time and there's people liking it or down voting it as you're speaking, yeah. Sometimes it felt a bit scrappy. But my sense was that people reacted quite well to that. We also did really it felt quite unusual, but we didn't get the whole regiment on parade as we used to do in 3 ranks in front of this commanding officer before PT. But at certain times we had people in kind of big blobs across the whole parade square, and now to shout pretty loud and people sort of socially distanced. I mean, that felt a bit awkward, I'm sure, for everybody, but people understood the purpose for it. And yeah. I wanted to explain to people why we were doing such a thing. And the unit was hugely busy. And, we were, at one point, I was in Greece with a subunit, a squadron. I had a squadron in Croatia and a squadron from another unit attached to me. They were in Slovakia all at the same time. And I had a squadron in Oman and a squadron in Kabul. Yeah. And they were orchestrating the withdrawal from Kabul. So we were literally globally dispersed. And that was a good old Teams call. Yeah.
But that's pretty normal, isn't it, for command?
I think it was. I think it did, when you have people in different time zones and different tactical situations, it is relatively normal to lead over the radio. I lots of military leaders would understand that. But I think I'll zoom back in on your point about, you sort of said, how did you ensure that your middle management did the ethos? I think one of the things that I made sure I did was I realized that I was on kind of a lot of one-to-many comms channels. So me on send on Teams, and then people coming back to me with a quick back brief. And that's fine, but people are speaking in, Colonel, I've got 3 headlines for you, nothing else to report, and that's great. That's their 30 seconds on the radio once a week or whatever. And you think, is that person okay? I sort of tried to instigate, one-to-ones with people, and there's quite a lot of one-to-ones with my subordinate subunit commanders, and I have like subject matter experts, welfare officer, padre, quartermaster, some other captains that with specialist output. So I'm trying to arrange those. I think actually we used to put them in, and then I'd say to the individual, listen, if I haven't got anything for you, but I'm not cancelling this meeting, like we can just sit and talk about your family, or your kids, or whatever you want to talk about in that time. But it's time for you. If you've got nothing to say and you want to wrap it up after 10 minutes and you're going for a run, that's cool with me. But it is I'm sort of giving you my time, if you like.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'd like to think that was a form of mentorship, because you're kind of looking out for your teams, the individuals that form your teams, their own, mental health and well-being. And, you could tell that people were worried. They were worried about their parents. They were worried about their kids. There was huge uncertainty. So just having a, human moment, albeit one that you had to kind of diarise and have it hold over Skype and perhaps in a different continent. I think that helped. I made a point of saying to the team, look, you can WhatsApp me whenever you want, any time, night or day, but I don't expect you to answer my WhatsApp anytime, night or day. You can do it whenever and I saw a good colleague of mine had a similar thing on his emails. He said, if you get an email from me at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's because I've got a wife and a young nipper, and that's when I'm doing my work. I don't expect a response for 48 hours. You're quite clear on that. And you see that a bit more often now. And I think that's useful.
Well, I think now will be a good time to take a quick break there. And when we come back, we will continue to talk about the parallels between command during COVID and some of the challenges that we feel in the commercial world. See you after the break.
It's interesting because you're bringing in a lot of conversation there that I think the listeners who aren't from a military background will resonate with, because it's things like out of office hours emails, or how do you manage Teams over Zoom calls, or whatever it is, which is quite different from a lot of our conversations on this podcast, where quite often we're saying, well, in a military context, we're, like you said, you're shining a torch down the breech of a weapon to make sure that there's no rounds in the chamber. Yeah, and we use that as an analogy, but actually what we're talking about here are real visceral management and leadership problems that were just as apparent for the commercial world as they were in the military. From my perspective, and I saw this with several commercial organizations, it also forced them to reckon with those sorts of challenges. So pre-pandemic, people were still getting out of office hours emails. People were still getting, WhatsApp from their boss at 11 o'clock at night, and then weren't sure whether they were needed to answer those there and then, or whether they'd be judged if they didn't. And actually, the pandemic and the having to work remotely as a default forced a lot of those conversations to happen, forced a lot of the processes to be put in place to make sure that we are, looking after our people. And I think it's really clear from your explanation how much you cared about the well-being of your organization, as well as the mission and the output.
I mean, I think back at Sandhurst, one of the first things you're taught as an officer cadet, as a trainee army officer, is John Adair's action-centered leadership. And I think you discussed it in one of your earlier podcasts. Team, task, and individual. And I think actually, as it's often remembered being taught, it's task, team, and individual. That's how it's. But I think that's a misremember. I think actually Adair didn't have task first. Now, for me, it's really hard to say as a military leader, but actually, in most instances, actually, if there's task, team, and individual, if I've got to trade out one of those, most of the time, I prefer to trade out task, because I feel that there's times when it's a non-negotiable. Often, if you've got to pay out one of them, it's probably let's compromise on the task rather than burning the individual or damaging the team. Because for me, it's about the future task. Or you've already got to be set for the future.
I think that's really interesting. And when we talked about Adair's balls, one of the it might have been the first episode. We touched upon the point of team, task, individual is very present. And of course, you've got to future-proof the team, future-proof the individuals, and future-proof the task. And as you said, there are times where that task is non-negotiable, both in the commercial world, because client has set a deadline, or in the military world, because we've got to take that hill. And that's when it pays dividends to have invested in the other two, so that you can start to sweat the people. You can start to put pressure on the team in order to achieve that task. But you can't do that all the time. You can't be at 100% all the time.
100%. I'd want to be careful I didn't come across as sort of transactional, but effectively every time you make a down payment on an individual's needs or an investment in the team's capability, then that is potentially a withdrawal that you can make when you need to get when the task is non-negotiable. But I'd be careful about making that sound too transactional.
No, I don't think it does at all. I think it's very clear that it's about investment in willingness, investment in the team's ability to step up and act up when, rather than carrot and stick kind of transactional approach, which is really interesting, because I think from a commercial perspective, we quite often think about the military as, it is that discipline, and discipline is what allows organizations to do really dangerous things. But actually, you and I both know that it's not. It's cohesion that allows teams to do really dangerous things. And discipline is actually something you don't have to resort to very often at all. It's incredibly important to have it in the background. We have, very distinct rules. We have Queen's regulations. We have, processes for discipline, but actually very rarely needed to be implemented, because the team is so
for me though,
on board with the mission.
The best bit of discipline is, I suppose self-discipline. That's a bit of a kind of military truism, but discipline that's not no capital D, as in it is about discipline is the good habits that the team gets into, rather than the stick that you mentioned. And I mentioned in our last episode when I was speaking about French and Raven's 5 forms of social power, and which for me means leadership, social power equals leadership, and they talk about reward and discipline as being two of them. Now for me, actually, if you look at military, actually reward, it's quite difficult to reward people instantaneously in the military. We work on a lot of deferred gratification. There's no bonus. There's no, there's some allowances for some unpleasant work, but effectively, if it's about transactional, like money in your soldier's pocket, actually that's about do some hard work now, you get promoted in the future. That means that you're going to earn more in the future. You get more responsibility. Your pension's bigger when you retire. It's about deferred gratification. So our reward, our carrot, is actually a long way in the distance. Our stick can be pretty, as a commanding officer, you've got powers vested in you akin to kind of like a magistrate. You can put someone in prison, but you can't use that lever, willy-nilly, because you have no people left. And you won't buy that goodwill. So I think discipline. I think the external view is that it's all about the discipline, but I would say it's all about the self-discipline.
You and I, in a previous life, both worked in an organisation, a military organisation, a hybrid unit, half regular forces, half reserve forces, and so reserve forces come in lots of different flavours, but are generally people who spend most of their time in their civilian careers and then do military activity as an additional work. And it was really interesting. I don't know if you found it, how many people came into the unit having spent most of their time in civilian organisations and were really shocked at how little the military shouts at each other. And actually, it's all very civil conversations, mostly over a cup of coffee, and it's problem solving by teams, rather than a sergeant major, pinning somebody up against the wall and swearing at them and shouting at them and covering them with spittle, which is the kind of Hollywood view. And I've worked, very closely with the US Marines, who are perhaps the most, glamorized as, you've got films like Full Metal Jacket and stuff. And of course, that is how it is in basic training, but working with them day to day, very rarely do people lose their tempers. We're all human, people do. But I think I've said that on the podcast before, I've shouted, other than times where it's just been noisy, I've shouted because I've lost my temper twice in my whole career, and I'm ashamed of both instances, because I see that as a failure on my part, a failure of leadership, rather than the way we get things done. I think there's a final element to this to bring it all the way back to sort of where we started in terms of mentoring and development. You mentioned the difficulty of identifying the value,
Yeah.
the immediate value of investing in people. So we talked about, making sure people are doing their jobs, here and now, but that idea of making sure they can do the next job, they can step up and take on that next responsibility. How does an organization value that investment? Because you are taking capacity away from the here and now. And we talked about the identification, taking risk, and all of that good stuff. But how do you justify that when the pressure's on, when you're limited on resources, when the deadlines are there, when you've got to achieve stuff, and the temptation is to put your A team forward because they'll just get it cracked?
Yeah.
How do you recognize the value in investment in the future?
Well, I think that constantly reiterating it through senior leadership discussions is useful. You've got to remind people. You've got to remind people of that value. Leaders have got to set that example. So, small example: we have in the military appraisal system. You have an appraisal level year. You have your MPAR, your mid-year appraisal, the 6-month point. And I've seen quite often when I've always been hard over. Right, if you work for me, I owe you an MPAR. And that is not just an email. It's not just a conversation.
So an MPAR is a mid-period appraisal review.
That's right. Yeah. And for me, it needs to start with some self-reflection from the subject. They'll give me their views on what do they think they've done well, what they're proud of, and the most important bit on the document is what do they think they could have done better. That's the most important bit of the document, not what I think they could do better. What do they think they could do better?
Yeah.
Now I've been doing it in this method, effectively asking my subordinates to start with self-reflection. I've been doing it now for about 5 or 6 years, and some people need quite a lot of encouragement to come out of their shells and offer it. They kind of think, I think some of them have thought, well, if I don't tell him the things that I do badly, he'll think I'm great because he won't notice them.
Yeah.
You have to get past that. When I'm conducting this MPAR with them, that's the first thing that happens. And then it's always an iteration. So I'll have a look at it. I'll probably email it back to him and say, hey, listen, you put this, and this. Can you answer, comments in the margin? How about these points? And then let's have another look. And then the final thing is a face-to-face conversation. So almost like a 3 or 4 stage phase. Could be more actually, depending on how it goes. So it's time intensive, both for them and for me. When I have the face-to-face, I'll say to them, before we get into any of this, how did you find the process? And most of them say, well, I've never done this before, apart from with you, if they were with me last year. Everybody seems to be grateful for the time, they recognize that I've invested in it.
Yeah.
And I think that, and I like to therefore think that sets an example for them to do it. Other people have joined, and just recently I did this process with somebody, and actually the first time I've done it for an officer from that service. And I lead a joint team at the moment, and he said, "Oh, MPAR, I didn't know whether we were going to do one." He said, "I've been in quite a lot of previous jobs. I've just been a quick email." No, this guy's a high performing. He's a high performer, right? A high potential. And I think, and I made the point to him, which is that your previous leaders might have been very happy with what you were doing, and therefore they don't need to have bothered to do an MPAR with you because they've got no feedback for you. But that touches on your point, Gareth, which is that often people give feedback to get someone good enough at the job they're doing.
Yeah.
But the MPAR's got to be about how do you fulfill your potential, and that's one of the questions that I've added to the question, which is where do you see yourself in 5 years? Yeah. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? And then the next question is what's going to stop you from doing that? And that could be anything. It could be a personal barrier, could be self-doubt, could be imposter syndrome, could be I really need to have a master's to do that and haven't got a master's. Well, guess what the answer is then if you want to do it. And so I do think that the way that you can make the case for mentoring in an organization is to make sure that at the top level, leaders do it.
Yeah. And
they can also buy in. I was fortunate. I'm in my next job, I'm moving on promotion, and as part of that promotion, we had an additional week's training back at Sandhurst, the home of British Army officer leadership training. And as part of that course, I had a professional coach.
Yeah.
Funded, external coach that was funded, and to have a couple of hours and some 360 reporting, etc., and some analysis. And I found it tremendously rewarding. I spoke about it on LinkedIn saying it was really good. And actually a friend of mine, civilian, actually ex-army, but he only did a couple of years, sort of 2 decades ago, now a founder of a tech startup, saw my comment and said, listen, I agree, it's great, but people can't afford it because good coaches are very, very expensive. And so you get back to this point about how do you make the case? If I would say if a company's leadership and organization's leadership is willing to fund it, either buying in externals or willing to resource it, e.g. from the time of those leaders, then it trickles down. If there's nothing going on above you, it's going to be difficult to imagine it happening bottom up.
Yeah, I think there's 2 additional points as well, which are probably so obvious to you that you haven't talked about them, but the army invests in, as you said, you've been promoted, and so you've been sent back to Sandhurst to do additional training, reflection, discussion, and I've been involved in some of these staff courses, and it's not training. You don't go and get lectured at, it's discussion, it's self-reflection, there's
peer-led in very, very many cases.
Very much so. And the second thing, so firstly, I don't think that happens enough in the commercial world. I don't think organizations take time out of their day-to-day operations to invest in their people's development, because of course in the commercial world, you take time out, you're not making money. But what you fail to see is the short-sightedness of that, of developing your people is going to save you money in recruitment, retention, and it's going to mean that your people are better at making money in the future. And the second thing is, in the military, writ large, it doesn't start at a certain rank.
No.
Command, leadership, and management training happens from the day that you walk in through the gates on your first day of basic training and get your hair cut, all the way through your career. So at every level, from the most junior soldier all the way up to the most senior general, you are constantly being challenged to develop your leadership potential, your managerial skills, and of course that is tailored as you go through. But I think that again is something that the commercial world sometimes doesn't recognize, and the army does this as well. In fact, all of the military does this as well as the commercial world. We fetishize the word leadership, and we think straight away that means the people at the top. So it's interesting that Sandhurst talks about itself being the centre of army leadership rather than the centre of army culture or command, and that's an interesting nuance, because I think we know that leadership and organizational culture are 2 sides of the same coin. And to be a good leader, you also have to understand culture. And I've talked about this on the podcast before. There are loads of books on leadership, and we think that to be a good leader, I've got to read all the books. And actually, I'm very much coming around to the view of, to be a good leader, you've got to make sure everybody else has read the books. So that you can understand where your limits on leading end, and where the people below you, their responsibility, their authority, that begins, and getting that balance right. And I know John Cresswell a couple of weeks ago talked about the boxes, and his job being to identify and set the boundaries for people to then own their own space within that box. And that comes back to this idea of command. I'd like to finish on a quote that I found online from an article you wrote for the Logistics magazine.
The Sustainer.
Command is a privilege, and when you are selected for it, you need to be first in for the bad stuff and last in for the good stuff. You aren't owed anything, and you don't get to choose what fate throws at you. So that was you writing about your lessons from command, and I think that epitomizes the approach that you've articulated in these last 2 sessions, about the way that you see command as both a privilege and a sacrifice that you undertake to enable the organization. And I think that's come across very, very clearly. So once again, thank you for giving up your time. You're welcome back anytime. And I think we will draw stumps there. So if you've liked what you've heard, please do follow us on Twitter. We're at the handle Battling with Biz. That's Biz with a Z. But for now, though, thank you very much for listening, and we would love to have you join us again soon. Bye bye.